Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. I'm very glad to be today joined by one of our authors, Mark Gornik, to talk about a new book by the late Andrew Walls, the Scottish historian of mission, who is best known for his pioneering studies on the history of the African Church and is a leader in the academic field of world Christianity. With Orbis, he published a series of groundbreaking works drawn from his collected essays. The first of these, The Missionary Movement in Christian History, Studies in the Transmission of Faith, was cited by Christianity Today as one of the top 100 books of the 20th century, which is something. When he died in 2021 at the age of 93, he left behind an unfinished small book he had promised to do for us for literally over 25 years. We had feared that project might be lost with his death, but the book is now available, and it is called Christian Conversion and Mission, A Brief Cultural History, and it is brilliantly edited by Mark R. Gornik, who worked closely with Andrew during his life as a leading scholar of his work. Mark is the director of the City Seminary of New York. He is the co-editor of another Orbis book, Understanding World Christianity, the Vision and Work of Andrew Walls. And as we were just saying hello to one another, he pointed out to me that today was Andrew's birthday. He would have been 97 today. Coincides with another landmark, the death of Pope Francis just today, which may have some relevance as well. We may get to that. But first, Mark, I want to welcome you here. Thank you for your incredible rescue and recovery and resuscitation of this project, which is really kind of a synthesis of some of Andrew's essential themes. And I wonder if you could just start by saying a little bit about really who Andrew was, his significance, and what his contributions were, and how this book fits into that work.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for staying with this book for so many years, and thank you for publishing his work. That in itself is an extraordinary contribution. Without Orbis, I don't think Andrew would have published the books that we have today. It was others working together to see his work come to light, and Orbis and you and Bill and others, Bill Burrs and others, really were extraordinary in that role. And so I begin with a word of gratitude to you and to Orbis for all you've given us and the ways that you've walked with so many of us in different ways. So Andrew Walls was, as he liked to say, he was born in exile, a Scot born in exile. He was born in England during a very difficult economic time for his parents, and but he was from Scotland. That's where he was. He was a Scottish historian and very much rooted in that tradition. Andrew went on to study at the University of Oxford, where he was a student of patristics, and really became deeply committed to this vocation of scholarship at a very early age. As he began to think about his life and his life with his family, Andrew answered a one ad almost. I think he described it once as on a bulletin board, to go to Sierra Leone to be a professor in Sierra Leone. And as he was a professor there, not a missionary, but a professor, he began to see all around him how Christianity was changing. He was both in Sierra Leone and later Nigeria. And in these two locations, he could see how Christian faith was thriving and growing in ways that were not in any of the textbooks, not in any of the articles he was reading or anywhere else. And he could also contrast that with what he saw going on in his home of Scotland, with churches closing and seminaries closing. And he began to see this extraordinary shift in Christianity. But before he saw a shift, he was really rooted in trying to understand the story of Christian faith in Africa and how this story was so critical, not only to the churches of Africa, but to all of us in the world church. And so he was an historian, and eventually he found his way back to Scotland, where he was at the University of Aberdeen. And there, after some years, he founded something called the Center for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World, the University of Aberdeen. And he brought together scholars and students who really began in a devoted way to study what was going on with Christianity. And then from there, he continued to work with others and see how ideas could develop around what was going on in Christian faith in the 20th and 21st century. And like few people, he helped us see patterns and images and possibilities that were happening right before us, but very hard for many of us to see.
I recall that he said that he felt when he was in Africa that he was kind of experiencing or witnessing something comparable to the story of the church in the Acts of the Apostles, as a new culture was kind of finding how Christianity connected with their own worldview and their kind of map of the universe. It was not just a sort of simple question, oh, they all became Christians. Well, no, it involves a kind of cultural transmission. And seeing that in Africa made him look at the history of Christianity in a different way too, because we kind of think of, well, Christianity first, it was a Jewish community movement, and it moved over to the Gentiles, then it made over the barbarians, etc. But he really traced the way in each of these places there was a kind of transformation, that Christianity itself was understood in new ways and adapted to new cultures. So it was not just all the same story passed from hand to hand.
That's right. And I think this idea of movement and activity is right at the heart of all of his writing. His first one that you published was The Missionary Movement. It's a movement. Then there's crossing cultural frontiers, and then the cross-cultural process. Andrew Walls understood in profound ways by telling stories and finding pieces of history and pulling together them into a larger picture, how this activity of the serial transmission of Christian faith, that is, Christianity doesn't always grow upward or downward. It grows in places that are unexpected and recesses in places where you think it would be strong. And this dynamic of constantly encountering different cultures was the dynamic that made Christian faith such a living faith. And that was at the heart of the historical work that he did as he began to see this pattern.
Well, in the first part of the book, he kind of goes through these serial kind of transmissions of the faith, and he begins, he says toward the end, people from all these different kind of points along the way would hardly recognize one another from previous eras. In the original Christian movement, it was entirely made up of Jews, and they understood who Jesus was as the Messiah within the history of Israel and the Hebrew scriptures, etc. This would have been incomprehensible to Gentiles in the kind of Greek Roman kind of world. Mm. And so we're familiar, of course, with the way that St. Paul became an apostle to the Gentiles, but we don't usually think about there was not just a change in customs and obedience to the law, but the transition he points out from Jesus as Messiah to Jesus as Lord, a whole different kind of language that a Gentile audience who were not raised on the expectation of a Messiah and all this sort of thing, could comprehend that or receive that. And then he shows how that continues stage by stage.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point for him, that he always stresses linguistic change. But then he would say, and this is at the heart of how he saw patterns, and that is the idea of using Kyrios, Lord, and then helped better understand the people who were more used to calling Jesus as Messiah. It would enrich this idea of being Messiah, and the word Kyrios would help enrich, or the word Messiah would help enrich understanding of Kyrios. In other words, Walls found that we really need one another to understand the fullness of Christian faith, not only the fullness of Christian faith, but the fullness of our humanity and our understanding of who God is in Christ. And so it was that interaction that begins in Acts 15 that really not only enables the church to be at home in every language and culture, but also that there can be growth and development within Christian faith about the riches and depth of Christ.
The importance of the vernacular in Christianity and the Christian scriptures is significant for him. It's not, we don't have just one language, Arabic or something like that. It is constantly being translated into a different language, and the language implies a culture. It involves assumptions or ideas that were there before Christianity came. And so there's this constant effort to kind of adapt or integrate the kind of what the Christian message is within the soil that is available there.
I think that really is right. And it brings us to probably the starting point for how Walls thought about Christian faith, and that is the Word made flesh from the Gospel of John. Walls saw that the incarnation was not just the saving event of the world, but a principle of how Christian faith lives and grows. And so every culture, every linguistic, every turn across space and time was a reflection upon that singular event of the incarnation. And so there is this basis in that. And so while Walls was an historian, he had a deeply theological understanding and an appreciation for how Christian faith was rooted in the heart of the Christian story, Christ.
The word conversion is really a critical word in the book, even in the title. And he shows that it has different kinds of meanings or connotations. And we usually think of it as someone who's a non-Christian, maybe becoming a Christian or switching from one form of Christianity to another. But he looks at that in a wider cultural framework and not just as an individual sort of movement.
I think that's a really great way of putting it. Walls distinguishes between sort of traditionally looking at in the book. We have recounted his perspectives on sort of both the Hebrew and the Greek understanding of turning and conversion, but also really the sort of often how we use it in our vernaculars as an internal change or an external change, and different ways that conversion is used. What Walls does, and I think it's really beautiful, and I've seen this again today as I was preparing and rereading it, is he talks about conversion as a response to the incarnation. If the Word is made flesh, if the Word is present to us, conversion, as he has it, is a response. And the other way that he thinks about conversion is it's a turning to. It's not just a turning from, but a turning to. And this is where Walls really is surprising his understanding of conversion for many of us, or I should say, his understanding of conversion can be surprising if we think about conversion as coercion. But conversion for him is turning who we are more and more towards Christ and having the light of Christ, that mirror of Christ, then as a perspective for the growth and development in both our individual stories. But as he really emphasized, it's not just the individual who experiences the conversion, it's communities and it's places and it's churches over time. And so it is a work not just of a moment in time, but conversion is the work and life of generations.
Absolutely. I was fascinated also by then his, the next kind of big movement that he describes, first the Gentile world, the Greek-Roman world. And then it's just as the Roman Empire is kind of collapsing under various pressures, particularly the invasion of the so-called barbarian tribes from Europe. And Christianity moves into the world of the barbarians, so-called. It becomes, for the first time, a kind of territorial or a national kind of understanding of Christendom, in which the people as a whole, kind of under the leadership of a king or whatever, all en masse become kind of Christian, right?
Yeah. And I think what he does with that is shows us that in response to the Christendom, which is that the missionary, the person crossing cultures, is one who learns how to live on terms set by somebody else. In other words, as Christendom fades and as it becomes really a clear problem in terms of the state and Europe, he shows how really one of the things that it invites us to understand is that Christian faith is always lived on terms set by somebody else. That is, we do not belong to ourselves, but we belong to the vocation and callings and to the places that we are. And so it's deeper than adapting. It's a spirit, and it's a response to that incarnation that is already present, that doesn't require Christendom to be present.
But it doesn't just end there, because he says, in all kinds of times when when the distinction between Christianity and culture becomes maybe being a Christian is, as Kierkegaard was saying, is to grow up in a Christian country or something like that,
Yeah.
not to be a real disciple. And then these kind of reform movements begin, the Reformation of the Anabaptists or the monastic movements earlier, or going back into the earlier time, the desert fathers who after the Christianity had become an official state religion, went into the desert to live a more radical kind of expression of that.
The theme of that radical Christianity, I mean, I think for Walls, one of his companions in his journey as a scholar and as a person of faith was Antony, from Egypt, the desert father. And, this sort of deep commitment to battling the powers, to giving all to Christ. And the way that Walls, in the ways that Walls talked about the book that he had, eventually hoped to publish, and was the basis for the outline that's here in many ways. One of the themes that he was still working on near the end of his life was comparing monks and evangelicals, because he felt that they had a similar sort of, I understand what Christian society is claiming to be, but that witness, it needs to be more deeper and more profound, and hence the Anabaptists, hence the monks and that witness, and then evangelicals were very serious about it. And he said that sort of taking that very more seriously and pushing back against the cultural conformity of Christianity was sort of this sort of radical movements that came up within that. Maybe not radical is the right word, but he would often use that word, that they were saying there needs to be reform, as you said, there needs to be a change within the existing structures of what people conceive of as Christian faith.
I was really struck. I heard Andrew deliver some of these talks about this. I remember the first time I heard him talking about Saint Patrick and how in his prayers, his Lorica, you see the gospel being translated into the kind of idiom and the worldview and the context, the culture of this Celtic culture, and all that signified. Can you recall anything about that you can talk about?
Well, I think, and that's, I think that was a great example for him, and it closes out one of the chapters in the new book, and that is he sort of walks through this prayer and then explains, as Patrick, in St. Patrick's prayer, within the prayer, how actually, the challenges and the challenges that one faces are really responded to by Christ. And hence the mysteries of the gospel are this deliverance from the powers, this deliverance from evil, this protection. Protection is a big theme, not only in Celtic Christianity, but within African Christianity that Walls would point out to. These themes of Christ meeting us where we are within our setting, within our cultures, that language informs this St. Patrick's prayer. And it informed the way Walls, and it's a great illustration, it's in the book, about how Walls understood how Christianity was constantly rising up, turning to a place, turning to the needs of a community and to a people in language that made sense.
Andrew was one of the pioneers in the kind of whole field of the study of what we call world Christianity, which began with this kind of eureka sort of realization that Christianity from the very beginning was a global, not in South America or something, but a world reality in North Africa and in China, India, the whole, now what is sort of the Arab world. And that we tended, Western historians have tended to look at this kind of transmission that goes from, the Roman Empire to Europe, the barbarians, and then mission kind of is sort of stagnant for a few hundred years until the Reformation, and then after that, the Age of Discovery, and then it goes back to Africa, Latin America, etc. But there are this origins in which there was an enormous diversity in the language and understanding, doctrines, theology among these local churches in Iraq and Iran and Ethiopia and whatnot.
Yeah, for Walls, Christianity was, in principle, if not in practice, always sort of a world Christian story. It wasn't something that occurred later on. He looked back at the 2nd and 3rd century based on the bicultural church from the book of Acts and seeing how it expanded into Asia and Africa. So he did see this much larger story that is not something new, but it was always in practice, if not, well, in principle, if not in practice, always there. But it's interesting you mentioned that on this day that we're both mourning the loss of Pope Francis and honoring his life and the witness that he left us for peace and for the migrant and for justice in our world. When Pope Francis was announced as the new pope in back in the day, 2013, am I right? 2000, sorry, not 2000, 2013?
Correct.
You're right. It's hard for me. Yes. In March of 2013, the headline that I printed out from the New York Times was "A New Pope from the Americas. Choice of Francis 76 of Argentina shifts church center of gravity." And that center of gravity, shifting the center of gravity, was language that Andrew Walls helped introduce into our way of talking about Christian faith. That there was a shift in gravity from the West to the non-Western world. And it was fascinating to me. I said, not only is this going to be very interesting papacy, and who knew? I certainly didn't know it was going to be as profound as it was. But, I certainly saw this represented the shift that Walls had identified, that had always been there in principle, if not in practice. And so it was a monumental moment for the world church. And I think it remains with us. But I think we also have this sort of language that was percolating, and Walls was simply identifying what he saw. He was trying to name what he saw. And I know others picked up on it, but this was the conversation that he and Lamin Sane and Kwame Bediaka and others were so critical in introducing into our public vocabulary even.
I'm glad you made that connection with Pope Francis. Definitely he was very committed to, as you say, sort of decentering this concept of Europe as being the center of Christianity. He said himself that he came from the ends of the earth. He was a son of immigrants in Argentina. He was very committed to mission, and by that he didn't mean just spreading the gospel or getting people to join the church, but reaching out to all the margins and peripheries with good news. And in his travels, going to places like one of his last trips was to Mongolia, where there's a very small Christian population, not going there to convert the people, but to be as a sign of brotherhood and solidarity. Kazakhstan, Central African Republic, Sudan, places like that. He came only once to the United States, sort of reluctantly, I think he made his message here. But otherwise, he was just sort of all over the place. And particularly, I think Andrew would really appreciate the Amazon Synod that he called for. Sorry. I was just thinking about Pope Francis's convocation of the Amazon Synod when he brought people from the Amazon there to talk about mission in the Amazon and how the culture of the Amazon should be a starting point for renewal of the church there. And there were bishops, Western bishops, who were thought it was very disrespectful to see Amazonian Indians wearing headdresses and that sort of thing. And Francis said, "There's no reason to think that's more ridiculous than the hats that we wear." But anyway,
I think Andrew would have said amen to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, I'm very grateful to you, Mark, for the work you did on this. I think it's a real contribution because I think it is a kind of synthesis. And once you read it, the ideas seem so almost self-evident that he's so persuasive, and you think, well, that's obvious, isn't it? And you realize how much he contributed to making this seem obvious, and why it's so relevant today.
Thank you again for publishing. I do think, and having worked on his writings, I knew Andrew for over 20 years and been part of editing a couple of his books now, 3 books now. I think it's a beautiful summary of his words that help us understand some of these themes, and just shows also the breadth and depth that he had. I think people would often comment about his humility, Andrew's humility, how he was not very assuming in terms of how he approached things, but he actually just somehow had this richness of historical perspective from years and archives and journals and conversations with other people. I think he was a gift to the church, and I think his thinking about conversion, I think it's a work the Spirit brought together in his life and gave us all the opportunity to continue it with Ingrid and his family and others and you and Orbis to do this. So all honor and thanks to Andrew Walls on would have been his 97th birthday, and with appreciation for giving us language to talk about the church in a new way. And in and of itself, I think he's given us so much to build on, and it's a joy to have been a part of this project.
Thank you. Well, this book is one of his last gifts, and I think a lasting one. And so thank you very much. It's Christian Conversion and Mission, a Brief Cultural History. It is very brief, as you can see. You can read it in a sitting. So please do. Thank you very much.
God's peace.